Press that. Cool. Yeah, so like most generally, I'm interested in your philosophy of religion. That means your overall metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, ethics, theory of, theory, like general metaphysics underlying your religious worldview, would be my general kind of question to put over to you. I've personally followed many of your conversations with John Vervaeke, your conversations with Garrett, my friend from the Symbolic World. And so there's different touch points where I've heard you discuss your perspectives and interests and influences. But I'd love to, just kind of put that to you and then maybe we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure we'll find lots of places we can go from the main trunk. So I tried to stay close to the sort of mainstream Christian Neoplatonic tradition, and this will have many branches, and it's easy to get lost in the sidetracks, I find. So, for instance, you can compare the way that Augustine got Christianity and Neoplatonism together versus the way, let's say, that Saint Maximus the Confessor pulled those two same things together, and you can find differences and start arguing very much. But I don't have super set positions about like those branches. What I'm much sure about is the main trunk of it, and that main trunk is actually common with even some other traditions to a large extent. So the basics of it are a metaphysics where you have different layers of being. Comes from, like, it can go from mere potential at the very bottom of the world. So let's say in Genesis, when it's written that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. This is prime matter. It's Aristotle's prime matter. It's just potentiality.
There was a whole Hermetic philosophy and tradition which built up around the prima materia, which was from Aristotle, which is an interesting branch.
Yeah, I don't know much about the tradition, but yeah, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have immaterial forms or patterns. So that would be the heavens. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So it would be Plato or Aristotle's forms. And these are abstract structures. You can think about math, about
Pythagoras, Pythagoras' monad and his music of the spheres. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, connected to that. And ultimately, both of those things, like the earth and the heavens, are like they both come from God. They are sort of both, and then it gets tricky to talk about what happens at this scale because it's so far from us. But like, it's two different creations, two different activities, the two different poles of creation, you can say, and it's within those two poles that everything will exist. So things will sort of concretize as they go down the layers of that hierarchy, and as you go up, then things will become more and more structured. So
will they become more real as well? When you say structured, will things become more real? Will you become closer to the source and origin of being? When you go up this tiered structure, this hierarchy?
That's a good question. I'm not sure, because I'd say if you take the Greeks, things would definitely get more real as you went higher. But there's a tweak in Christianity, because we don't say that God just created the heavens. We think that God created the earth as well. And further, with the incarnation, we think that like the reality of all of those layers of being became sort of solidly affirmed. So like And there are different thinkers in the Christian tradition who put this, let's say, in more stronger terms than others. So let's say in Augustine, it's not all that clear, maybe, that things get realer, that it's not that, maybe in Augustine things really do get realer as you move up and up. In some others, it's not as clear, but I would just
get
hesitate.
realer as you repent in Augustine, isn't that right? Like his Confessions is all about how like being is becoming real through his repentance and his going over of his whole temporal and finite existence.
Yeah, getting rid of the parasites on being that evil constitutes. So then it can be interesting, because maybe in those cases, like something that is low on that hierarchy, but that isn't being parastatized by evil, could be more real maybe than a human who has access to all kinds of forms, but it is also like parastatized by evil and sin, so then has to get cleansed from those sins to become more real than the things that's lower. So I'm not sure where I would put.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I would have to think more about it and see what different thinkers say about what's more real in all of this reality, and all of those layers. Yeah, I would tend to, I don't know, to be honest. I definitely do think that all of those layers can be real, let's say, and this union happens at all kinds of levels, the union of potential and form. So you have that in particles, in atoms, in molecules, you have this in organisms, in humans, all of those layers.
Can we experience it, do you think? Can we
What do you mean?
I mean, can we experience the way things come together, the union of heaven and earth, potentiality and form, and like pattern and potentiality, like when those things come together properly, is that something we can like personally experience as human beings? Is that accessible in our experience? Because I've been looking a lot at phenomenology as a philosophical method, and I think it's a really interesting key to talking about all of this stuff. Because it puts experience first.
I don't know if you read David Bentlert has a great book titled the Experience of God, Being Consciousness Bliss, and I find that he lays out really well different paths to experiencing God, or those different aspects of God, you can say. And like through the book, it's sort of an exercise at the same time. Like he's giving you arguments, but at the same time, he's like helping you see those things and practice so that you can notice them in different aspects of your life. So like we have a drive, like things in general sort of strive for intelligibility, you can say. They strive for heaven, for patterns. And you can see that in everything that exists.
Wait. What do you mean? Things in general. So that's an interesting claim. And I think it's worth qualifying that claim, because I would say that rational beings, for example, strive for intelligibility. Do all animate beings, do animals all strive for intelligibility? I wouldn't maybe go that far. Would plants and minerals, would they strive for intelligibility? Depends what we mean by that intelligibility. It's possible, but could you qualify that a bit?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I used in some articles intelligibility sort of with a capital I, and I mean it sort of in logos, or where forms come from in general. But I realized it could just be a confusing way of putting it. So let me say instead that everything strives for the logos from the place where forms come from. So let's say in anything that you can take, really, insofar as it is formed, then you are seeing some matter, some potential that is being shaped by a certain pattern, a certain form. So it can be with anything. Like you can take a proton, and that proton has some matter. It could decompose into all kinds of different particles. It could just disappear into potentiality, but it stays together in the pattern of a proton. So that's a kind of striving that like those fundamental particles have towards the form of proton. And it's true for everything that exists. You have matter being raised up into a certain form. And it happens fractally. So within me, I have all of those, let's say, protons whose particles are being raised up into the form of protons. But at the scale of me as a whole, like all of my protons, all of my cells are being raised up into the form of JP as well. And we can experience it whenever we see, well, David Bentler will explain, everything we see something good or true or beautiful, we see something getting raised up to the logos, to the
very
pattern.
Platonic argument, right?
Yep, exactly. So we can experience it. It
Beauty,
can happen within ourselves.
truth, goodness.
Yeah.
Virtues in the world, virtues being embodied in the world by people in certain stories, saints, virtues, holy people. Yeah,
because those are all instances where someone or something is being raised into a higher pattern. And then there are qualificatives we can add about this, because you can be raised up into an evil pattern. That can happen as well. And then we have to say that, well, okay, you're getting raised up into a pattern that is somehow higher, but at the same time, it's parasitizing some even higher level pattern. So it's a bad. So you would have to qualify some things. Just because something is higher, it's not necessarily better.
And the whole power of literature is about the possibility of the transformation of a character from one point into a betterment usually, but maybe it's a descent as well.
It can teach us about how, like, what the map of those patterns look like. So it's why we like literature. It's why we spend billions every year on like making movies, and we spend tons and tons of hours watching them, is because we're learning about how things come together in patterns, especially at the human scale. That's what movies do. But they're like in the sciences, if you study chemistry, or if you study also something bigger, maybe economics, and like in all of those cases, even though you're getting further from the human level, you're still studying patterns and how things reach into patterns, and there's still beauty and truth in those things. We don't find them as interesting typically as what happens closer to the human level. It's normal because we're humans, but still, like every place where we see beauty and truth and goodness is a place where we're seeing some things being raised up into patterns.
Raised up into real patterns, ontologically real, ontologically prior, ontologically grounding patterns. And this ontological priority is the foundation of knowledge, really. Instead of opinion, knowledge is when your thoughts are conforming to the pattern, the logos, the order of the thing that's being contemplated. It's interesting you say that even something like a proton, or maybe a cell, or an organ or an organism, is striving, I think is the word you used. They're striving towards logos. I agree they exhibit a logos, they exhibit a rationally intelligible order. It's such an interesting way of phrasing it, striving towards that logos. I guess it's true, because there is like an epicenter in a cell, like the nucleus, which is organizing all of that information in the cell and the activity of it. And there's a tendency towards that order, I think. And if you want to think of that as an animus or a spirit in the whole of nature towards that order, that's pretty beautiful thought. And then what makes humans specifically distinct is the nous, or the rationality, which seems to be able to abstractly or simply formulate these forms and these patterns. And that's what the whole sphere of human intelligibility is, strangely. So all like the laws of physics and mathematical theorems and things like this.
Mhm.
seem to exist in that on that plane, in that realm.
Yeah.
But what
Yeah,
about
it's
higher? What about angels and demons? That's
mhm.
stuff that I've thought a lot about. Like, how
Yeah.
do they exist? And how do
Mhm.
cities exist? Because I
Yeah.
do think that cities do exist in
Mhm.
so far as they have an anima towards a logos, you could say, exactly the
Mhm.
same as a cell or a proton.
Yeah.
Cities do have that anima or that animus towards logos and higher order and the
Mhm.
expression of goodness, truth, and beauty. Cities have history, cities have been known at different points in space and time. And so then how can we coherently speak about Bristol as a idea, as an ADOS, as an idea of a city? How can that exist across space and time with the
Mhm.
different ways you can participate in it? And then also, what are the higher intelligences? What are the higher intelligences that reign in the city? What patterns of worship are set up towards demonic or angelic realities, and what is the difference between angels and demons? Like, some of
Mhm.
those questions I think are quite fascinating.
Yeah. It's similar to the other layers we mentioned. So in the same way that you can have a human that assembles a whole bunch of cells under one pattern, under one form, then this can happen with many humans assembling under one principality, one demon, or one angel. So like we have many examples of this in scripture, but we can look at everything going on around us as well, and we can see
The
groups that come
local
together or not.
authorities, the local authorities are like political authorities, aren't they? Almost like literally speaking, like um, aren't they the more proximal authorities, like the authorities of the city or the authorities of the state? And how do
There are
they
probably,
relate to spiritual authorities?
yeah, well, there are even things before you get to spiritual, even before you get to, let's say, the city, because a family can also be the same thing,
Sure.
where in the same way that, and really the criterion to evaluate this kind of stuff is, are you dealing with something that is reducible or not? So when, let's say, we say that we as a human, let's say that a human is not reducible to its cells, but like there's this, often in modern cognitive science, people will speak of emergence. There's something that is above the
Mm-hmm.
cells that you cannot reduce to the cells that will constrain the emergence of potential from the cells. You're dealing with,
In
let's say,
Aristotle's logic, he would call that a species, and I think he might even call it an accident or like an idiosyncrasy, which differentiates a species, a particular, from a genus, a broader genus. The general categories of the genus and the universals are particularized through species differentiation, and so like that
mhm.
differentiation process is happening. Um, yeah, through accent
Yeah.
or idiosyncrasy in Aristotle's logic.
Okay, so that's like from the going top down. That's the terms that he uses. I know
That's the
that
Porphyrian
going
tree.
okay, I know that going bottom up also. He says like things can assemble in accidental forms or substantial forms. So
Accidental, yeah. Okay.
in the case of accidental forms, so let's say the way that let's say these glasses come together,
Mm-hmm.
well, these are reducible. Like I can reduce the glasses to their components. I could probably reduce them to their molecules, and I wouldn't really lose any sort of explanatory power. But in some other cases, like that of a human, if I tried to reduce a human to its cells, then I would lose something. Like I would lose consciousness, I would lose rationality.
Definitely.
So in the the term,
There's something fundamentally irreducible about our being in the world, like your
mhm,
being, JP, and mine as
mhm,
human persons. There's something fundamentally irreducible about that.
yeah,
I would also call that accidental. Like Heidegger would use the word thrownness to describe
mhm,
the existential condition. I think you and I are both thrown in a certain existential sense in terms of language, location, age, era, all of these different influences, which Heidegger would call our thrownness existentially.
Yep.
And I think that could be associated in Aristotle's logic with the accident as the differentiating principle into a human person. But I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, it's a different kind of, it's a different use of accidents. Often Aristotle, when he talks of, let's say, accidental form, it's sort of looking at it bottom up and seeing that it's not coming together as a single substance that is irreducible. But maybe you could do it sort of the other way in Aristotle, thinking, well, you have, because what Heidegger says sounds to me more like, I mean, it's about considering the accidents around you, maybe, considering so it's not the fact that you're an accident, but you're sort of thrown into a world of accidents, maybe that you can say.
But and so then for Husserl, the phenomenologist would then say, well, that this chair in my room at this time, this particular chair, is the one that I have, is an accident. But what I perceive in the chair is its universal essence. And Husserl makes this existence and essence distinction. And he says it's nothing about the existential particularity of this chair that makes it a chair. It's actually its pure universality, its pure essence that is a coherent meaning, or logos, we could say, about the chair. And that's almost on a ground beyond its temporality, its existence in time. It's actually on an eternal plane there.
Yeah, and it happens like through humans in this case. So it's interesting, and you can see this like right from Genesis, and even like thousands of years ago, you had, let's say, Philo of Alexandria speaking about this kind of stuff, where in the first few chapters of Genesis at creation, you can see everything being recapitulated in Adam. And recapitulation, and like you can even trace back the etymology. I think recapitulation is about like being brought under one head. So like you have all of those different layers that are being created in Genesis. So there's the heavens, the earth, then there'll be like the light, then there'll be like water, like all stuff comes down right to the middle. And
generations.
Then, and with Adam straight in the middle on the sixth day, it's interesting because you'll see Adam participate in that pattern, where Lewis has a nice phrase. He says that humans are amphibians in that we have access to the realm of ideas, the abstract realm of heaven, but at the same time, we're also material creatures. So we bridge between those two in our being, and we can bring the world outside also in union because we are those amphibians. So let's say when Adam names the animals, he's taking, let's say, something that exists already outside in the world, like a cow, but by naming it, he's bringing it into a higher kind of pattern. So you were speaking earlier about the chair. There's something, let's say, that makes the chair not spatial temporal when it enters into contact with a human who is not just a spatial temporal creature. So by naming the animal, bringing it into a pattern with humans that have access to the heavens, to the forms, we're bringing creation, like we're sort of, St. Maximus speaks of man as a laboratory where we sort of pull creation and we raise it up. So it's something you can see, let's say, in Genesis, in Adam.
We raise it up. Interesting.
Yeah. Because we take spatial temporal things.
Very interesting.
We take spatial temporal things and bring them into a non-spatial temporal reality. And we can do the opposite too.
Let's talk more about this, because I remember one of the most striking pieces of content that I looked on your channel was this thing you did about prayer. And it seems like that's probably deeply connected to this, because I was reflecting on just how fundamental prayer is. Prayer is asking. And there were three estates in medieval Christendom: those that pray, those that fight, and those that work, which were the monks, the knights, and the farmers. And the monks were the ones that pray, and praying means to ask. And actually, you don't get any intellectual tradition at all unless you pray, ask. Because
Yeah.
to ask, to posit a question, is to formulate a question and ask, to seeking a certain kind of knowledge to be gained there. So that asking, that praying is really, really deeply connected. It's like the wellspring of our intellectual traditions, where the monks were the ones who preserved all of the traditions of antiquity, the Greek philosophers and so on.
Yeah, in all traditions, really. Like there's no intellectual tradition ever that didn't start from receiving something.
Yeah. And then they basically prayed, like the different disciplines, history, theology, philosophy, all of these different domains branched out from praying. And you could even make that argument about early scientists, where a lot of them were Christian and were basically praying. They were meditating and praying upon certain fundamental questions, and it yielded certain spiritual fruits in the form of knowledge, we could say. So how does prayer order reality then? Because you were just describing it as raising it up, and I really like that, because I'm looking around my bedroom, looking at the books, and these are all ways that paper and ink and ideas and experience have been raised up and coalesced into these things called books that I have. Okay, that's cool. Or the different artwork or the different things around. It all has been raised up, in a sense.
Yeah. It happens in, like, it's a dialogue, and it happens fractally. So let's say you can take something simple, like maybe you're trying to solve a certain problem around you at your job. I don't know. Maybe you're trying to build something, and like you need to make the pieces fit together. So you're like taking this multiplicity of things in spatial temporal reality, and you're wondering, like you're asking a question to your intellect, to your reason, to the part of yourself that has access to non-spatial temporal reality. And you're wondering, how do those pieces fit together? You're trying to make a chair, let's say. Like, how do those pieces fit together? And by questioning this abstract non-spatial temporal part of yourself, you can, let's say, have a flash where you see geometrically how to fit the different pieces together. And geometry is something that is not spatial temporal. Like it's like you're dealing with truths that are not spatial temporal. They will unfold in space and time, but they don't depend on space and time. Let's say the Pythagorean theorem.
It's an activity of pure reason, isn't it?
Yeah.
Geometry is an activity of pure reason, and so it's like pure mathematics. And Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason was all about that pure reason, and then he had a critique of practical reason as well, which is more about morality and particular cases and stuff like this.
And then, like, once you so you ask that question, you have that insight, and that insight is a kind of receiving. So like you prayed by wondering, like, how do those things fit together, and asking something non-spatial temporal. You receive an answer, but this answer is a kind of seed. It's abstract, like you know all the pieces fit together, but you still have to fit them together, like concretely in space and time. So this idea will unfold. You will unfold it. So once you receive, you go and act out that solution. So that's for a chair, but it's true at higher levels of reality as well. Maybe you're having problems with your family, and your family is starting to fall apart. So the different pieces of your family are starting to fragment. So you take this concrete spatial temporal problem, and you ask for a solution. You pray, you ask for like spiritual truths, psychological truths.
Or to your family members you pray. Like asking to speak, asking to meet, to come together, these kind of prayers call into being higher levels of participation and engagement with reality.
And
that whole empathic discourse is prayer, like it's asking and being sensitive and compassionate.
And maybe together, as you're having a certain dinner, for instance, and you're gathering and asking those questions, and you're together praying, trying to ask, like, what can we do to fix the situation? You get an insight. Maybe a few people in the family have it at the same time, maybe one person, but like you'll get an insight, you'll get something abstract, a kind of seed that you can then work out and apply in your family. So that's, you're mediating between heaven and earth when you're doing that. You're taking a concrete problem, finding an abstract solution, and then applying that to into the concrete world. And it happens at even higher scales. So let's say if you're a bishop, then you're dealing with this kind of issue, but at the scale of thousands or tens of thousands of people, and you're still taking into account, let's say, the fragmentation that you see, and praying, asking for an abstract solution to that, which you can then apply. So
what is a daemon?
A daemon is when, well, typically we want to say that they're higher level patterns, something that's higher than ourselves. We were talking earlier about angels and demons of cities, for instance. And so it's possible that the higher level patterns are lined up towards the ultimate good. In those cases, you're dealing with like angels that haven't fallen. So maybe a church could be a good example of that, where people are gathering together into a higher level pattern that is ultimately oriented towards the ultimate. So the place where all patterns come from.
Yeah.
But people could also
gather. So that's an angel. Communion in a cathedral city is an angelic principle. So even going to participate in the services within that cathedral or that church is a form of participation in an angelic pattern. Would that be reasonable to think about it that way?
Maybe I could tweak. Maybe I would tweak some details, like maybe because we think that we ultimately participate in God Himself, but we do that through like communion under higher level patterns. So communion in a church, which is a body, which is like I wouldn't say that the church, let's say the parish I go to is named after Saint Thomas Aquinas. So I wouldn't say that we gather, let's say, in Aquinas himself, but we definitely gather with him. Like the pattern of the church is like at least close to Aquinas. I would have to think more to find like the exact relationship, but like because I'm just not sure like how the details of the hierarchy would go. I know that we were definitely with Aquinas, and even you can even see how he's shaping us, because we still like talk about him, we read about him, we celebrate some festivals. So like we're taking some of our own lives and sort of turning it up to Aquinas to think about our lives, and then this will also have impact on us, like because we read them, then we'll have some influences that come from this, like it will shape the way we see certain things, we say certain things, like it shapes some of the things that I've been saying to you today because I've been reading Aquinas. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we become, let's say, the body of Aquinas, but maybe like, because we're not just that, we would have to find out the details. We certainly gather under him somehow, but we're not just him either. And like, he doesn't just depend on us. I wouldn't say that Aquinas disappears if there's no more people praying to him. So anyways, I would have to think more about the details, but we can already, I think, start thinking about demons, because I think like you asked me twice about it and we sort of veered off, so I'm going to try to answer it. But in the case of demons, it would be people gathering under a pattern that is higher, but that isn't directed towards the ultimate good. So
I've thought of it as accepting all of that worship onto yourself. The pattern that does that is a character, a spirit, a pattern. If you accept all of the worship onto, because the whole of reality is worship. If the whole of reality is prayer, truly, then it's going to be flowing up, and it's going to be flowing up, and there's going to be receiving and giving of prayer, isn't it? All the way along the ontological chain. And so at some point you could just rebel and accept it all onto yourself as the end of that, instead of offering it higher.
I think that's good. As a parasite, like you just like you insert yourself into that chain and you sort of absorb things rather than turning it out.
Sort of like Mr. Smith in The Matrix.
It's been too long since I watched it. I can't say.
Okay. Parasites.
Yeah,
cool.
And there are other things you could probably say, like René Girard has some really good insights about how groups can gather positively or negatively. So I think that in the case of, let's say, a demon that's taking all of the praise onto itself, you'll also see some scapegoating happening below. So people will be like, because it's not a functioning hierarchy, because they're, if you're cutting yourself up, like if the demon is like taking everything onto himself, like he also won't receive things from higher, because he's not like turning things higher in the hierarchy, so he's not receiving from higher in the hierarchy, and that
Yeah.
means that to keep surviving, you'll have to sacrifice things below. So Girard explains that what happens, let's say,
That's crazy.
yeah, but so Girard explains that if you look at archaic societies, they're always sacrificing like people, like first off, that's how it started. But
Oh, JP, because I was talking to my friend recently who's
yeah,
really into his Aztec and
yeah,
Mayan mythology. He's deep into it. And he was saying that when the Catholics came to the Aztecs were ritually engaging in blood sacrifice on top of a hierarchy. And basically, I was like, I recognize that as the scapegoat pattern
yeah,
from Girard. But also, I learned about it in the Lord of Spirits and the Day of Atonement rituals and stuff like that with the scapegoat. And I was like, oh my God, that's a scapegoat pattern. And so
yeah,
when Christ comes into that culture, it's just an inversion of that whole hierarchy of the scapegoat. He is the scapegoat. And it's
yeah,
like the key to it's like the logos key to that whole mythology. And so they
yeah,
recognized it. And they also recognized that he'd poured out his blood, and that blood was involved as a sacrament, and they recognized that as well in their own way. And like
yeah,
there are all these deep narrative continuities, really, and
yeah,
religious ritual continuities.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so the conquistadors realized that when they saw the Aztecs, they thought, well, they're worshiping a demon there, because that's what demons do. Like they take the worship unto themselves, and to do that, they need to sacrifice things below. And like that's what allows the group to come together. Like the Aztecs, if you look at them, the way Girard would explain it is that they would have all kinds of chaos going on in their city. Like people would blame one another. You'd have like in any society, like you have things that fall apart, and the way that you resolve that is that you need to find another way to come together. Like because you can't have a society where everyone is going their own way. Like you have to come together somehow. So you can either do it in a correctly functioning hierarchy, as we said earlier, like in a church, where you all worship together something higher that itself is turned higher.
Yeah.
Or if you don't do that to an angel, then you're gonna have to do it in a way that sacrifices something else. Like so, Girard explains that as people get angry at one another, at some point, naturally, people will start to blame some kind of people or someone in particular more than others, and everybody can pile on, and that allows everybody to come together against one person. So you sacrifice that person, you come together again. But in doing that, you worship something. You worship a demon. That's also what it means. So I think
You worship something that accepts that as payment in a way, right?
yeah, accepts the death as payment for order.
That's what you're worshiping. Yeah. Yeah, the angels and demons one's a really good one. Like, because I think it's so real how they exist in the world in terms of just narratives and how they conquer whole spirits. Like they actually, I feel like they offer like demonic powers. Like how Satan said to Christ in the desert of like offering him the kingdoms of the world and all of this splendor basically, and Christ was like denying him through humility. I think one who's living in pride can similarly make bargains with that voice of Satan, who will afford certain powers and certain techne and enhancement, some kind of dark enhancement, which will be forged through prayer and sacrifice at that kind of altar. And I think the whole cycles of criminal behavior and things like this are governed by those kind of spirits and those kind of unholy deals. And then also repentance, the possibility of repentance in the judicial system. I've watched like crime documentaries with like big legal cases, and the whole question of whether someone's fundamentally evil, and you watch 15 people discussing it who are in the jury, and they're all discussing, is this person fundamentally to their core evil, or is there hope and possibility of repentance and redemption for their soul? And that is a question of free choice, because what that would mean would be that they are in deep patterns of prayer. If it comes down to free will, then they're willing this kind of satanic pattern into being, and that they could repent and turn the other way and will an angelic pattern into being. And yeah, I mean, that's all there in the narratives of justice, of crime and justice, and all of that whole area of the world. And that's deeply theological stuff.
Sorry, I was muted. Do you put that in the same kind of metaphysics that I laid out earlier? Like, how do you, what's your background in ontology? We just talked about me so far, but yeah, I'd like to have an idea of where you come from as well.
Yeah, that's cool. So I think it comes down to like Plato for me, because every other author following Plato is basically a commentary on Plato in some sense. Like, there's just so much debt we owe to Plato's work. Anyway, so this like kind of medieval discarded image of a cosmic eros, a cosmic love, a cosmic harmony, which was poetically envisioned by Dante, which was there in Plotinus's Enneads, which is there in Plato's Symposium, Boethius, Pseudo-Dionysius, like all of these authors, emphasizing this vision of an ultimately good telos, an ultimately good, eminent, superabundant source, which then flows down and out, structuring lower layers of being. And that there's a mystical way in that after the freedom of our souls can then aspire to desire, which is what eros means. So Plato's Symposium is all about eros, and Diotima's ladder is saying that I desire a proximal good, I desire something lower, and then I elevate my eros towards higher kind of ideals, which is exactly what Dante's whole narrative is, his personal narratives and the writing of the Commedia. Like, that whole story arc is governed by that basic pattern of Diotima's ladder of love, the aspiring heart higher and higher and higher still. So that Christian metaphysics of love, I think, or eros, is really powerful, beautiful, and important. I think that underlies a lot of the currents in contemporary philosophy and the humanities, and really important. Well, in the sense that value, concern, worship, all afford meaning. Like, that's how we value, and humanities is concerned with the way in which we value. And I think undergirding that is this whole discourse that goes back to Plato, about the ontological foundations of the arche, or the logos, or the eidos of things. Husserl picking that up in a continental tradition, talking about his essences. Merleau-Ponty putting that in the body, talking about our embodied, the phenomenology of the body. Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke both mentioned a book that I'm going to have arriving, hopefully now or sometime soon, called An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, I think it's called, which is another thing about the brain being embodied and the way in which the body is phenomenologically primary or something like this. Anyway, so that whole rich continental tradition of philosophy, the phenomenologists in particular, is so fascinating. Pajot, Peterson, you can't make sense of them without the phenomenological tradition. If you grant certain phenomenological assumptions, then you open the door to everything they have to say. But if you deny those assumptions, then that's a fundamental point where you can diverge. And I think that's what some maybe naturalist philosophies might want to do. They might want to say, look, we don't grant your experience epistemic validity. We don't grant experience we deny that. And I think there is a move to wanting to deny that, perhaps in logical positivism, or perhaps in some forms of naturalism, which I'd like to learn more about. But that's my understanding, is that that's the move they'd want to make. They want to say, look, empirical sense data, what can be empirically validated, this is our epistemic source of validity, guys. It works really well for the empirical sciences. Just leave the whole personal experience, religious experience thing out. That's not valid. And so, do you see what I'm saying? I think that's a very fundamental point in the discourse, which has to be recognized and thought through, because I do grant those premises and follow along with what Peterson and Pajot and many other thinkers, who I would call phenomenologically informed thinkers, are saying. But there are important questions to be raised right at the beginning. Is it valid to investigate our experience in this way?
Yeah, I think John Vervaeke does a good job explaining that bifurcation in his episode on Galileo. I think maybe it's called The Death of the Universe, but he explains that, well, there was, I think, I don't remember all the historical circumstances. There was a lot of them, and John explains many of them.
Quality gets denied, quantity gets affirmed, is the basic epistemic shift in Galileo, which is tremendously important.
Because
like flattening.
Yeah. Well, he still ends up being a realist, but he says that the only real things are the ones we have access to via mathematics. Like, we can't trust even our senses, but we can trust the math. So that's sort of the move.
Still quite realist. That's still quite Platonic realist, actually.
Yeah.
That's interesting, isn't it?
But it ends up dying later, though, because it made sense when Galileo. It made some sense when Galileo made that move. I think there was also social chaos sort of going around at the time. So it facilitated the intuition that we can't trust our sense perceptions, that we can trust our own phenomenology. But at the same time, like, science was starting to give some results. So it made sense to put sort of all of our faith on mathematics. And it sort of went fairly strong for a while, but at some point, there started to be too many issues. So in recent decades, there's a problem of consciousness that has become super clear. There's also the fact that in cognitive science, when people started to, okay, well, now that we've tried to mathematize everything, can we maybe try to mathematize the human mind? And then realizing that it sort of was there, and not even just with phenomenal consciousness, that's our experience of things, but also with rationality. Like, it doesn't seem that you can sort of reduce rationality to something lower, because if you try, then you end up denying rationality. So you're then you end up using something that is not rational to try to talk about rationality, but in doing that, you presuppose rationality, so you sort of undercut yourself. That's a Platonic point, but there are naturalist thinkers like Putnam and like John who make that kind of argument. And there's also just facts in to try to build robots, like very concretely, to try to build things that act as if they had reason. You end up having to deny like some basic materialist assumptions. You have to try to put things in a body and like have them experiment. Like, so you give your, let's say, your computer, it won't be intelligent if it's just a program. You have to give it a body, and you have to like put it in an environment where it interacts with things. So that's like J.J. Gibson. That's one of the things he talks about in that book. But so this basic move of, okay, well, we will give primacy to something beside consciousness, namely to mathematics. Like, it ends up not working in practice. There's also the fact that just in the sciences themselves, you can't really reduce, it's not obvious that you can reduce things like all the way down, because what you end up really like is that there's nothing at the ground layer. There aren't, it's not that obvious that you have particles that you can reduce everything to. Like, it looked plausible until maybe about 100 years ago. But now it looks like if you wanted to reduce everything down, at the lowest, what you have is just potentiality. So, and you can't just reduce things to potentiality, so that doesn't really work. And also, so you have all of these arguments, and also on the other side, you have just what happened in the 20th century, like the idea that we could just get everything through abstract, detached reason, and like the world would just keep getting better because we have a good grasp on reality finally. It just like totally collapsed with the two world wars. And it's clear in Europe, like one reason why positivism is still going stronger especially in North America.
That's actually in chess as well. I'm really into my chess, and in the history of chess, you have a romantic era in the 19th century, which then collapses under like the sheer logicism of like Steinert and the Russian school, which dominates basically the whole of the 20th century chess. And then it collapses to Fischer in the 70s, who plays the Trojan, I think it is. I can't remember the master he plays. Yeah, and so that's really interesting.
I'm not familiar at all with that story. Can you say that again? What was the parallel?
So Steinitz is a German master in the 19th century who introduces this idea of like logical rigor to the chess game. Control the center, develop your pieces. Like there's certain there's a logical order here to be got and to be mastered and to be systematic and underpinned. So Botvinnik in like the 50s was the master who trained Garry Kasparov, who was the 20-year reigning world champion, maybe one of the best chess masters ever. So Botvinnik, he basically in the 50s, basically all the world championships all the contenders were all Russians. So it was Russians winners and contenders, and it was pure dominance for many, many, many decades, really, in the 20th century. And it was broken by Bobby Fischer, famously in the 70s, an American, at the height of the Cold War. And anyway, that whole school is a parallel cultural development to what you're talking about, this systematic rationality, the faith in that, and that kind of move.
And would you associate Fischer with sort of the breakdown of that way of thinking?
I would say he was one of the best geniuses ever, and maybe the best player ever. There's strong arguments for it. And he just exemplifies genius. He just, at the chessboard, is genius. Like some of the moves he makes, computers can't see. And that's when they're asked to give the move, they don't give it, but he finds these incredibly beautiful combinations, which I think are kind of angelic principalities or muses of some form of logical order that he can envision somehow through a noetic capacity. Anyway, so Fischer's brilliant. But I think what I'm trying to say is there's a spirit, a living human spirit that's the bleeding edge of the game, which is more than just systematic rationality or more than just imaginative, emotional, romantic moves from the 19th century. It's not just romantic, it's not just logical, rational. There is a certain living genius in the game. And that living genius is intuition. Like Carlsen, best in the world, has said himself it is intuition, and he gets frustrated with interviewers who ask him, how do you do it? How do you make these world-class moves all the time? And he's like, it's just intuition. I can't explain it to you. I just know that is the right move every time. Sorry, but like that is just what I know. That's how I know it. And like, that's his position. And I think that's a really beautiful segue into these topics around AI and consciousness and machine learning and stuff like that. But beautiful note to consider.
And to come back to your point about the bifurcation, so you have, especially in Europe, you have phenomenological thinkers who try to deal with that problem, let's say more directly through philosophy, and it happens much earlier than what you see in North America, or even in England. Like people were still positivists longer than in continental Europe, but you still wind up with like those two currents coming back together again, like in an interesting way, because in the English-speaking world, I see that there's a comeback of classical metaphysics as well, because like with all of the problems that I mentioned earlier, so we try not to give too much place to human consciousness, but you wind up with structures that are super classical. So we already talked that even since Galileo, people would give ontological reality to mathematical patterns. And then initially people were trying to just like reduce everything down to particles, but now it doesn't work anymore. What you have at the very bottom is just potential. So what you start to have is a world of heaven and earth, you know, where you have like abstract mathematical patterns and you have concrete potential at the bottom of everything.
Yeah.
So you end up having back a kind of hierarchy. And with this hierarchy of patterns and potential, you can start to talk about human consciousness that has a special place in that hierarchy because we have access somehow to those abstract mathematical principles, but we're also material. So you can sort of.
We also have we have access to higher intelligences who can discourse with us in some way through prayer and through asking. And like that's what reading is, and is calling upon ancestral patterns of the past to inform.
Yeah, or like even like concretely, like writing to your mayor is writing to a higher intelligence, and or being arrested by a police. That's also like having a higher being speak.
I had it with my PhD application recently. It all just felt like prayer. It was literally like it was prayer, and then it was answered. It was like, oh, cool. Like, but it was that whole thing. It was like the pattern of the institution.
Yeah. So it's funny because like you end up healing the bifurcation some other way. Like you can do what the phenomenologist did, and it's really the role that Pajot has taken, where you start really from human experience and you try not to get too far away from it. Or if you go the route of, okay, well, we'll explore things that are besides human experience because there seems to be something stable in mathematics. But if you keep pushing that, you wind up creating a hierarchy that functions the same way that phenomenology functions in the end. So it's interesting, like those two paths. Yeah, but I guess you're more attracted by the phenomenology itself, and not so much. Well, not as directly by the, let's say, classical hierarchy that isn't as directly phenomenological.
How do you mean? So, how do you mean the classical hierarchy isn't phenomenological?
Yeah, well, let's see what I talked about earlier. It's not as directly phenomenological. So, because I made the point without talking about human consciousness, at least directly. Like I talked about potential, I talked about patterns, and then the human mind winds up having a special place in that hierarchy, and it's the place through which we enter. Let's say we can say that, but we sort of recognize it almost as a surprise at the end, because I was really engaged in abstract metaphysics, you know, something fairly far from, at least on the face of it, at least fairly far from immediate phenomenology, and I was more using, let's see, what kind of ontology the science give us, but then at the end, I wind up with like a structure that I think can map well with what you find in phenomenology, but I didn't just engage fully in phenomenological reflection from the start. Sure, don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I don't know. Phenomenology has just been particularly important for me personally. Like I read a book called The Sacred and the Profane by Mircea Eliade.
Yeah.
A really important book for me, and one that's very phenomenological, really. He's talking about the revelation of the sacred as being ontologically foundational. And I was fully behind that. And I think like listening to Peterson, reading Eliade, and that was a real important conceptual platform to listen to what Pajot was saying, and like to take the Lord of Spirits stuff seriously, and all of these different things like that. And it all comes from having this phenomenological approach, which Jung himself had. Wait a minute, JP. I'm just gonna I've just got to keep my ear out just because I've got these books around.
Yeah, yeah, that's good.
What? I can't remember.
Yeah, we're talking about phenomenology and the other way of getting to the structure.
Eliade, Eliade, Peterson, both. convinced. I thought the phenomenology piece was really interesting. I've just ordered some Percival and some Heidegger, so I'm going to be trying to read through both of those, and some Corbyn, Alone with the Alone. And he's immediately on the first page mentioned phenomenology. I just think it's a crucial and important philosophical language which is afforded to us, really, and is so pivotal in all of these conversations. That's what I think. I think it's a general category, a universal category shared by all thinkers in this space, talking about these kind of topics within religion. And there's a logical point of divergence where if you deny certain axioms for the phenomenological worldview, and people do, and people have attempted it, and there's real tensions and criticisms to be explored there, I think. If you do that, then you branch out into a fundamentally different philosophy of religion, viewpoint of religion, I think.
Is it possible that your input isn't the same as before? I think your sound used to be slightly better before you went up, so I don't know.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I mean, it was still okay, but it wasn't as good as before, I think.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's not really for me. I still hear you, but yeah, for people who might listen.
Cool.
Yeah, but yeah, I think I see what you mean. I more see it as it's definitely a danger, I think. If you don't grant those philosophical, if you don't grant those phenomenological moves, it's still possible to get back to something similar through what I mentioned earlier, like exploring, okay, well, if we deny it, let's see what happens. And we found out that you get into problems and you wind up reinstating the same kind of hierarchy. So I think it's possible to deny it from the start, but then still come back around. But it's definitely like risky, because like once you start looking, let's say, outside of human experience, you can sort of get lost at other layers. So let's say when I was speaking about the hierarchy earlier, let's say if I said, okay, well, I won't just take, we'll do the Galilean move. Let's say we won't just take human perception as like the building block for our epistemology, we'll take math. Well, then you're starting to look at events, like at the events, just abstract patterns. And you could just stay there and be like an idealist. Or like you can do the move that many people made of being materialist. So we're going to use math, but just to look at the fundamental building blocks of reality. And we won't talk too much about the ontological status of mathematics. We won't be mathematical Platonists. We just won't talk about it. We'll say that there are particles and we describe them with laws, but those laws don't necessarily exist. So you could get lost at that basic layer of reality. But I think that if you like start from those different issues in the hierarchy and you just keep looking and try to fix the problems that you see there, like you'll end up finding that there are real problems and you need to get back those different layers. And by the time you do that, you will sort of wind back up at the same place as the phenomenologist started from. But now you still, like, you can keep that old hierarchy, but now it fits within, I don't know if it fits within, but now it's in relationship, let's say, with your phenomenological existence. So that's why, like, even when I speak to Jonathan, for instance, we come from very different standpoints and we wind up still understanding one another, because I took the whole route of like looking at like getting stuck at, let's say, the mathematical or the material, and it's through time working through those philosophical issues that I ended up finding, well, okay, I mean, if I want to deny phenomenology, then I end up with that whole hierarchy. But then I wind up speaking with Pajot easily because like he took phenomenology, and within phenomenology, you can see that hierarchy going on as well. So we sort of have two different starting points, but we can still talk to one another nicely at the end. Like you'll still see that like those different paths end up having different tendencies. Like Jonathan is much better at pointing out human level patterns, you can say, like analyzing stories and like all different kinds of human level things. But it'll be easier for me to speak about atoms, and like all of those different layers of reality exhibit the same kinds of symbolism. But But yeah, I just wanted to make that point of like,
I'm
if you
down with
bifurcate,
atoms,
you can still come back.
because I think the atomic structure is like a mystery, and like there's a real monadic element to it. If you go to Greek, the monad from is it I think it is Pythagoras and maybe Parmenides or Heraclitus as well. There's this idea of the mystical monad, like the one, like, and it's just there in an atom.
Yeah.
That is what the modern idea of the atom is, that it is a monad. Okay, guys, it is a monad. Like, just look at it. So I love that. I love that logos. It is a very direct window into the pattern nature of things, definitely.
All right. I don't know if you had more questions. I should probably go soon.
Let's wrap it up here for now, and then I'd love to just continue speaking, JP. That was really cool. That was awesome.
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah, we should do this from time to time. We can reach out again when we have an idea of what to discuss, but this was fun.
Cool. Thanks, JP. Thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot for having me. Bye, Sam.
Yeah.